In 2009, two business owners in the same small city lost almost everything within months of each other. Terrence's construction company, built over 14 years, collapsed when the housing crash dried up new contracts and left him holding $340,000 in business debt he personally guaranteed. Yolanda's boutique marketing agency folded around the same time, leaving her with $190,000 in her own debt and a bankruptcy filing that followed a year later. Both lost businesses they'd spent over a decade building. Both were roughly the same age, mid-40s, with families depending on them. By 2019, 10 years later, Yolanda was running a new, profitable consulting business with a healthy six-figure income and had rebuilt a stable financial position. Terrence was still working a job well below his previous earning level, still carrying resentment about what had happened to him, and had never really attempted to rebuild anything resembling what he'd lost. Same magnitude of financial disaster, similar starting point, a decade later, two completely different lives. Researchers who study financial trauma and recovery have found this divergence isn't primarily about the size of the original loss, or even about access to resources afterward, though both matter. It's substantially about a set of psychological and behavioral responses in the months immediately following the loss, patterns that predict long-term recovery far more reliably than the dollar amount lost ever does. Understanding what separated Yolanda's decade from Terrence's reveals something important about financial setbacks that almost nobody explains clearly while someone is actually living through one. The first difference is how quickly each of them separated their identity from what had happened. Terrence, for years afterward, described himself as someone who had failed, framing the business collapse as a permanent verdict on his own competence and worth, a framing that made every subsequent financial decision feel like it was being made by someone who had already proven himself a failure. Yolanda, within the first year, had reframed the collapse specifically as something that happened to her business, a market event compounded by decisions made under conditions nobody could have fully predicted, rather than a verdict on who she fundamentally was as a person. This distinction sounds almost semantic from the outside, but it carries enormous behavioral weight. Someone who believes a financial disaster reveals a permanent truth about their own inadequacy has very little motivation to try again. Someone who understands it as a specific, survivable event has every reason to keep moving. The second difference is the speed and willingness to seek outside help, rather than managing the aftermath alone. Terrence, embarrassed by what had happened, avoided talking about his financial situation with almost everyone, including his own spouse in any real detail, and never consulted a bankruptcy attorney or financial counselor, choosing instead to slowly negotiate individually with creditors himself over several exhausting years, while continuing to take on new financial strain, trying to avoid the label of having failed publicly. Yolanda, uncomfortable as it was, met with a bankruptcy attorney within the first 2 months, formally discharged what needed to be discharged, and met with a financial counselor to build an actual recovery plan rather than managing the crisis reactively, one creditor phone call at a time, for years. The shame of formally addressing the situation head-on turned out to be far smaller and far shorter-lived than the years Terrence spent quietly managing an unresolved crisis alone. The third difference is what each of them did with their time and energy in the 12 months immediately following the loss, and this is where the actual financial trajectories started to diverge most sharply. Terrence spent much of that first year in a defensive posture, taking whatever work was immediately available regardless of fit, while much of his mental energy went toward replaying decisions from the failed business, unable to redirect attention toward anything forward-looking. Yolanda spent a comparable amount of energy during her first year, but directed toward specific, concrete rebuilding actions, reconnecting with former clients to gauge interest in an entirely different, smaller consulting model, taking a part-time role that covered immediate expenses while she rebuilt, and treating the disaster as data to learn from rather than a story to keep retelling herself. None of this means Yolanda's path was easy, or that Terrence's continued struggle reflects some simple single-character flaw he could have corrected through willpower alone. Financial trauma carries real psychological weight, and the shame, fear, and grief that follow a significant loss are legitimate responses that deserve real acknowledgement, not dismissal as something a person should simply move past through positive thinking. Yolanda has been open, in later years, about how difficult and frightening that first year genuinely was, and she credits a combination of professional support, a small circle of people she was honest with about her situation, and specific structured actions, rather than any innate resilience she believes she was simply born with, for the outcome that followed. There's also an important caveat about resources and circumstances that shouldn't be minimized. Yolanda had a spouse with stable income during her rebuilding year, a factor that gave her more room to take calculated risks than someone facing a financial collapse with no financial backstop at all. Recovery from financial disaster is genuinely harder, through no fault of the person experiencing it, When there's no partner's income, no family support, and no financial cushion of any kind to buy time for rebuilding, the behavioral patterns that separated Yolanda and Terrence mattered enormously, but they existed alongside real differences in circumstance that make some recoveries objectively more difficult than others, regardless of mindset. What research on financial recovery consistently suggests, though, is that the specific behaviors, separating identity from the event, seeking professional help early rather than managing crisis alone for years, and directing energy toward concrete forward action rather than replaying the loss, are available, at least to some degree, across most circumstances, and meaningfully improve recovery odds even when someone's starting resources are limited. These aren't personality traits some people simply have and others lack. They're specific, learnable responses that a financial counselor, a support group, or simply a clear-eyed understanding of the pattern can help someone adopt, even in the middle of a crisis that feels, at the time, completely unsurvivable. Terrence, in his late 50s now, has begun, slowly, to describe the 2009 collapse differently than he did for most of the decade that followed, no longer as proof of who he fundamentally is, but as a specific, painful event that happened during a specific, difficult year. It's a reframing that came a decade later than it did for Yolanda, and the financial gap between their two recoveries reflects that decade directly. But it's also, he says now, a reframing that finally made it possible to consider trying again, at 58, in a way the version of himself from 2010 never once believed was available to him. Financial setbacks are not defined only by what is lost. They are also shaped by what happens after the loss. The response in the months following the event can influence the direction of the next decade. Seeking help, separating identity from failure, and taking deliberate action create a foundation for rebuilding, even when the original setback feels impossible to overcome. The biggest difference between recovery and staying stuck is often not the size of the loss, but the response that follows.